Hello and welcome back to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer. I'm a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, and this is my co-host and colleague, Sam.
And I am Sam Wang, professor of neuroscience and molecular biology, and I run the Princeton Election Consortium. So let's see. So today, a topic that has been on our minds is the question of what presidential elections are, in the sense of what is it that people are voting on. And the idea I wanted to talk about, I hope we would talk about today, is what's the role of the incumbent administration? To what extent is a general election a referendum on the incumbent party that's in power? And I wonder, Julian, what your thoughts are on this topic.
Well, I mean, it's obviously on the minds of every voter in one way or another. So, most people don't follow politics day in and day out. They have some sense of who the candidates are by this point, especially this year with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. But it seems that in most elections, it's often an election about what you thought of the person who's in the White House already. And, it plays out in different ways. So sometimes, like in 2008, it really did seem to be a lot about how you felt about the Bush administration. And that played into the campaigns of each of the candidates. And sometimes it's even, it's kind of complicated. So, the hard one to talk about, I'd love to hear your thoughts, is 2000, when on the one hand you have Bill Clinton is enormously popular and the approval ratings are, skyrocketing, and yet there's this underside that Al Gore is dealing with of the scandals and, a different part of the presidency that he is concerned about. So it's always front and center, but it seems like in different cases it plays out very differently, and it's not always clear what the effect is of the incumbent. I mean, what do you think of how this works?
Yeah, that's an interesting one about 2000. It is true that Clinton came as a unique mix because, of course, there was that shadow of impeachment that had just come immediately beforehand. I'm not sure I have good insights into 2000 except to point out that there is also the role of the economy. And if you look at long-term models that are not really about, for instance, Ray Fair's model, Ray Fair from Yale University pioneered this, the idea of models like bread and peace, where you take things like presidential approval, you take GDP growth, and you put those together into a calculation of what is likely to occur. So you mentioned 2008 as well. If you look at 2008, that campaign started off with Obama in the lead, and that lead intensified late in the season because of the more or less immediately following both the first debate and also the economic meltdown. And so what we see in the dynamics of 2008 are some kind of movement up and down, either favoring the Democrats or favoring the Republicans, in which what it looked like through the lens of polling is that the race was moving up and down around some point, as if joined by a rubber band from some place where things were going to head. And where the race is going to head was driven, as I said, by how voters feel about the incumbent and feelings about the economy, maybe secondarily things like whether we're at war. And this is close to what political scientists say. So when I look at the data, it looks like, as I said, there's this sort of rubber band effect where things are headed towards some natural point. And in some sense, the role of campaigns is to pull things towards that set point or to try to, by force, get things away from that set point. So I would say that it looks like incumbency plus the economy, and that is not necessarily such an original insight, but you can really see it in the numbers as they move up and down. And I think the last few elections have been like that. Although the other thing I'll say is, even going back to 2000, that one thing that's really, I think, unappreciated is how little movement there's been during campaigns. If you look at opinion, going back, I think, to 2000, back to 2000, there's been remarkably little movement during campaigns. It appears to be that voters choose up sides and they are kind of committed. And so whatever this temperature is.
I mean, you think is that because of partisanship, or does that have something to do with opinions being set already by the current administration? And in some ways that's what people are voting on from the start. So either like them or don't. I mean, do you have any? I have no idea if it's possible to disentangle something like that.
Well,
But
yeah, I think it can't just be the administration because we've always had incumbents and we've always been able to say, that SOB in the White House or those SOBs in Congress. And so that's been with us a long time. The one thing I'll just point out is that if you look at the issue positions of the two parties, the issue positions have gotten further apart as measured by quantities like this DW nominate score that's been cooked up. And so the parties have moved further apart. There's less overlap in issue positions. And culturally, there seems to be a strong separation between partisans who support either party. So it looks like, I would say broadly, that it looks like about 40% of voters are pretty committed to Democrats, 40% are pretty committed to Republicans, and 20% or even less have any hope of being undecided. So this year, I would say, it looks like, if I had to, looking at the numbers, it looks like about 15% of voters this year can't verbalize to a pollster who they're going to vote for. They might have preferences.
yeah,
We make decisions without being aware of them all the time. That's a well-known cognitive principle from cognitive research. But about 15% of people just can't quite get it out of their mouth whether they support either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And we can, we could get into why it is they can't say that.
and this year Obama is going to be, it looks like, very active in the campaign. So you have one issue of how do people and how do candidates react and relate to the existing president. But then you have certain cases where the president is really out front. And it's hard to think of a example, certainly in the last few decades, where we have had a president who's going to be so active in the campaign. We obviously had in 2008 where Bill Clinton was doing it in the primaries. He was very proactive with his wife going after Obama. But the relationship is often tense between the incumbent and the person running from their party. Reagan and Bush had a pretty tense relationship in 1988. Obviously, as we said, Gore and Clinton. Gore really didn't want to run with Clinton. He didn't want Clinton in the campaign. You can go back to 68. Hubert Humphrey really didn't want Lyndon Johnson anywhere close to his campaign because Johnson was the problem. But in this case, this year, it seems that Obama won't just be out there talking about what he's done and talking about Clinton. He's actually been in a somewhat of an attack figure early on against Trump, really going after him. So it's interesting to watch a president so political and so engaged in the campaign, and I assume that could have a big effect when you combine that with his approval ratings. And he's not someone who's always great at this role, and all of a sudden he's an incredibly effective political figure. So I think it could be a big factor in how this all plays out right now.
Yeah, well, if you look at approval numbers from previous years, think back to 2008 when Bush's approval was pretty low, and he wouldn't even appear in person at the Republican convention. Whereas if you look at Obama's approval numbers now, ever since the beginning of the primary season, right, when Democrats and Republicans started winning primaries, Obama's approval numbers started moving up. And one answer might be, well, gosh, people are looking at these candidates who are available and thinking about Obama, and for whatever reason, maybe they're thinking, I don't know, if I had to guess, maybe they like Obama pretty well after all. And Obama's approval numbers right now are at a net approve minus disapprove of plus 2%, which puts him about where he was when he got reelected 4 years ago. So Obama's approval numbers are pretty good. And when the incumbent's approval numbers are good, well, who wouldn't want to appear with that president? And if you look, and it's exactly as you say, he is out there front and center. I was just reading, actually, I mean, it's a multi-front war. I just was reading yesterday an article that he and his aides prepared for the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it was this dense, evidence-filled, figure-filled argument about what was happening with the Affordable Care Act. And I have to say, he is not being shy about sticking up for his legacy.
Yeah, and I think it's both talking about his legacy, and he provides a contrast to Trump that's quite striking in terms of his style. So it contradicts David Axelrod, who says that voters always vote for the opposite of the person in office. So if you have cerebral and calm and dispassionate, this election should be favoring the person who is the opposite, which would be Donald Trump. But it's unclear that's going to play out this time, given how erratic and unusual Trump is. There's something simply, not in terms of the policy, but in terms of the governance style that Obama can say is part of what a Democratic administration would be. That might be appealing. Obviously, maybe Axelrod is right. He was right in 2008. But I think there's something to that and to why his presence might be pretty important.
I think that we tend to overread recent events. I mean, no offense to Axelrod, but I would say that anybody can be right about one data point. So if it's kind of like the joke about using a dog to tell the weather. You put a dog outside, and if the dog's wet, it's raining. And so, okay, fine. So 1 year we go from Bush to Obama, so evidently people must want the opposite thing. And so, I don't know, well, maybe this year, if Hillary Clinton wins, then they wanted the opposite thing because they wanted a woman. If they want Donald Trump, they wanted the opposite thing because they wanted a white guy. I think that one should be careful about reading too much into very small numbers of data points. I mean, I would just stick with a general observation, which is that popular presidents get out there front and center, and they are part of what a new candidate runs on. And so, of course, Hillary Clinton wants to attach herself to this guy whose popularity is high. Broadly, I would say that if we're looking for ways to measure the popularity of the incumbent party, at least at the presidential level, we haven't talked about lower levels yet.
Yeah.
We have different measures. One measure is how Hillary Clinton is doing, but that obviously has specific factors or baggage, whatever you want to call it, having to do with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And so that's a measure both of the incumbent party and also what people think of those two candidates. Then we have Obama's approval rating, which is kind of closer to the incumbent party because Obama obviously personifies the Democratic Party in many ways. And then there's other sentiments like the generic congressional vote, right? Ways in which people say, okay, a pollster says, all right, I'm not going to ask you about Obama or Clinton or Sanders or Trump or whoever. I'm just going to ask you, who do you think you want to vote for Congress? And that's a number that's been moving pretty strongly towards the Democrats in the last 3 weeks or so, like amazingly strongly.
What makes this a little unusual to figure out is, A, that Hillary Clinton wasn't his vice president, nor is she disconnected from his administration. So it's not a case where we have an election where the relationship between the existing White House and the candidate of that party is totally separate, basically. There is this close connection where the debate will be about Obama via what Clinton did as Secretary of State, yet she has a little distance in that she served in a particular role. She has a history of tension with Obama, and so there's one level of this relationship which might be a little different than a case like Gore and Clinton or Bush and Reagan in 1988. And the second aspect, obviously, there's two previous presidential administrations which are very relevant to the debate about her, meaning Bill Clinton. And in the primaries, this was as important in some ways as her record with Obama. What Clinton politics represented in the 90s on race, on economics. And I don't know with voters how much that will matter, but certainly with the politicians and with the campaigns, this is a big part of the debate. And Donald Trump will be talking a lot about Bill Clinton and trying to forge a connection between some of what he will call the underside of that administration with what you're going to get from her. And added to that, you have the foundation. So there's post-presidential politics, which even will matter here. So it's a little different and interesting to think about how all that might combine to shape the dynamics in this campaign.
Yeah, that's all pretty interesting. I think the thing that we're probably going to see in the next few weeks is that there's going to be, as we roll into the two conventions, these things get talked about. Both candidates and their parties will be front and center. Well, I mean, there's some question about how many Republicans will show up at the GOP convention, but to a large extent, the current state of the two major parties is going to be on display for several weeks at the convention, and so people will get their first look. Surveys show that people are unusually engaged in this year's election, which I don't know, as a policy fan, I am a little bit not necessarily into the fact that this year of all years, finally people are super engaged. But anyway, people are going to be watching, and they're finally going to get a close look at these candidates and the parties that they are representing. And so if you look historically in the last few elections, the margin between the two major candidates has broadened after the conventions. What happens immediately after the conventions is one thing, but to some extent, undecided voters start choosing up sides and being able to say who it is they're going to vote for. So it feels to me like we're going to see things. If I had to guess, I'd say that things would move towards how voters feel about the incumbent party. And I should say that the incumbent party is not just who occupies the White House, but also who's in control of Congress at the moment, right? And that's the Republican Party. And so I think that starting after the conventions, rolling into Labor Day, these things will start appearing in the data.
There's also the other part of it is how this impacts Trump, not simply vis-a-vis is Obama popular, so does that make it difficult for Trump to do well? But feelings are so hardened about Obama, and there's so much passionate dislike of this administration, certainly among Republicans, that it could be really important to how can Donald Trump overcome all the divisions we keep talking about in the Republican Party and some of the concerns about who he is he really a Republican at all? There might be a way, even if Obama is popular nationally, that the dislike of him in red states is really important to why Trump might have a path forward. And even in some of these swing states, I assume that could be at play as well. He can capitalize on that to push back against any anti-Trump feeling that exists. So far, as you've said, we haven't seen that in some of these states, but I could imagine that becomes a factor, especially if Obama inserts himself more and more. Trump can make it a mandate about him.
Yeah, it's not so clear how much difference it'll make in swing states. The data pretty strongly show that Trump has some ground to make up among Republican voters. And if you look in deep red states, he's performing very weakly compared with Romney 4 years ago. I mean, Hillary Clinton is sort of Obama light, lagging by a few points, but not by an abnormal amount for this point of the season. Trump is really lagging Romney in those states. And so one way for him might be to go negative and to really call out that contrast and remind people in those states how much they dislike Barack Obama. I will say that that again, I just want to come back to this a little bit. I think this could be pretty important down ticket, because if you look at districts at the congressional level and Senate races and maybe even legislative races, there are a lot of things going on down ticket where what happens at the top of the ticket could conceivably have an impact. And right now, the generic congressional preference, if you look at 4 or 5 pollsters, it looks like Democrats are preferred by a margin of 8.5% over Republicans. That's a median of 5 surveys. And that's a pretty large margin. And so I think surely the Republicans are having their concerns realized that this could be really bad for them. What's going to happen to that number between now and November?
But when you say that he's doing poorly in these red states compared to Romney, there's still no risk that he's going to lose those red states, is there?
Not much risk. But, there are a lot of races that are within 5 percentage points. One would not necessarily expect Arizona to be within 5 points, Kansas to be within 7 points, Utah to be within 5 to 10 points. These are not states that the Republicans should be sweating over, and yet there is something happening there. So I would say actually, I would be surprised if those states went into the Democratic column in November. But they are looking surprisingly close. And if you think about how congressional districts vary within a state, if you're an incumbent Republican in one of those states, that is not a strong position to be in, because sure, if you're used to winning your district by 10 to 15 points in a normal year, that's okay. But if the tide goes out, then that might not be enough anymore. So I really think that down ticket is a place where these things are going to be magnified. And just to remind people, Democrats won the popular vote by about 7.3% in the congressional vote in 2012, but didn't retake control of Congress because of population factors, because of gerrymandering. I apologize. They won by 1.2%. They needed 7.3% to retake the House, and they didn't come close to that. So if they're 8 points up in the polls, that could do it. And Democrats have said, strategists have thought of it as a pipe dream that they could retake Congress. But that is a very favorable number that they have right now.
How do you explain, so this is from a numbers perspective, an election like 1960, I'm throwing something specific, but there you had Dwight Eisenhower, enormously popular. The economy was doing well, relatively peaceful moment, and yet it's a close election, but Nixon loses. And all of those benefits that you'd think would accrue to him don't. Is that just, when you look back at something like that, is that about the candidates? Or is there another way to think about why the outcome could go differently, even with all these numbers?
Yeah, that was quite a long time ago. As we were talking about in a previous podcast, one thing that Kennedy did there is he brought on Lyndon Johnson, and having Johnson on the ticket really pulled in people who might not necessarily want that, 40-ish, boyish Catholic from Massachusetts, and so there are some interesting things going on there. I don't have a good answer for you except that to point out that something that you've pointed out, which is that the appeal of adding a vice presidential candidate in that way, and also then of course there's sort of a tense relationship between Ike and Nixon that's been written about. So I don't have a good answer.
The reason it came to my mind isn't simply his approval ratings. It's this question of people not liking Hillary Clinton, and
okay.
There's an element of that with Richard Nixon. Long before Watergate, there was something about him that people didn't like, and some people didn't trust him, some for partisan reasons, some just because of who he was. And obviously in this election, you don't have a John F. Kennedy on the other side. You have Donald Trump, and so he is equally disliked. But it seems to be an element, at least of the national conversation, and it came up again with the emails after the FBI released its statement and report about how much this can hurt her and how much this might dampen some of the benefits that Obama should naturally bring at this point with these kinds of approval ratings. I don't like her.
I guess that's true. I guess that there's just this visceral dislike of Hillary among some partisans. Among a lot of partisans, I suppose.
Even Democrats.
Yeah, if you certainly one way that shows up in numbers is Clinton-Trump matchups show Clinton ahead, but Sanders-Trump matchups show a larger gap between the two candidates. So that could possibly, one explanation for that is Hillary Clinton's unpopularity. Another explanation for that is possibly that Sanders has crossover appeal. Now, though I would lean towards the latter explanation because Hillary Clinton is not necessarily running weaker than Obama in blue states. And so it looks to me like whatever one might say about Hillary Clinton if one is a Republican and talking about the things that have been in the news for her, she's not necessarily running. She's not running behind Obama in, in Ohio, in Virginia, in certainly not in California and New York. So I think that this is something that's going to become clearer. My feeling is that we've got a bunch of undecided voters on the sidelines, and I think it's going to really come out in the next month or so whether what you're alluding to is really a driving factor. And I think like what I see right now is there's a certain disconnect between Hillary Clinton's numbers over Trump, which are a narrow lead on the one end, and Obama's approval and congressional preference on the other end. And the thing I'm going to be watching for in the next month is to see whether these three numbers converge, because it feels like they ought to converge, but they haven't quite yet.
And the final thought on this with Obama is beyond moderates, beyond swing states, two very specific constituencies that seem to be very important in this election. One, African Americans, and so does his presence on the campaign trail improve turnout? And will that have an effect as it did in 2008? So that's somewhere where you would imagine he can bring a lot to the table by being proactive, given his popularity in the communities. And then I don't know how this plays out with, the issue of immigration, because I would assume he is far more popular in these communities than Donald Trump will be, yet he has this mixed record now, the deporter-in-chief label. But it seems he could be an asset in bringing out the vote in very specific parts of the constituency that matters this time.
Yeah, well, let's see. So African American turnout has been up not only in presidential elections, but relative to expectations, it's been elevated, I believe, in off-year elections somewhat. So it's an interesting question to see whether that change in turnout is a lasting phenomenon that goes beyond 2008 and 2012. One thing that's curious about Trump is that he's not actually running weaker among Hispanics than Mitt Romney. You might naively expect that somehow he would run weaker, but I don't know, maybe there's a floor effect and those voters are already lost.
You mean it's about the same right now?
It looks comparable. I may have to retract this at a future date, but I've been looking at some numbers, and he doesn't necessarily look weaker, despite what one might expect.
You think part of that has to do with mixed feelings about the Obama administration because of deportation, or is that not?
Oh, I don't know about that.
That it dampens some,
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's hard to know what the reasons are for these things. These questions are a little bit harder to unwind, right, because you have to go drilling into the crosstabs of polls, and I hesitate just a little bit to get into the reasons for these things. Mm-hmm. But I will stick with the statement that something interesting to watch is going to be black turnout and whether it remains elevated. I think that'll be interesting to watch. Black voters liked Hillary in the primaries, and so they might turn out in force in November, and if that's the case, then they will be proportional to their numbers in the population, and that would be a favorable development for the Democrats.
Well, that wraps up this episode, and please join us next week when we'll continue our discussion. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon on Politics and Polls.
Thank you, everybody.